Wajibanda do bimbira, bimbira, wajibanda do bimbira, wajibanda do bimbira, wajibanda do bimbira, wajibanda do bimbira.
So then to the more serious questions, but there's still light in that connection. And for the ones who don't know who I am as well, you can ask me that question when I asked you the first one. But the first question is, obviously, you're sitting here 20 years in to your work. And you're watching this film, I assume not for the first time, obviously. What do you feel today, sitting here watching this film? What kind of emotions and thoughts is coming to your mind watching it right now?
Thanks. Firstly, thank you for having me. I've watched, I think this is the third time I'm watching it, and it's always emotional for me because there are so many bits and pieces of my journey which I often connect when I watch the documentary. So it's quite emotional, and also the fact that some of the grandmothers in the documentary are no longer with us. Again, it's so it's always emotional. Yeah.
Now you can ask me the question.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from, so we can.
That will do so. So we can move on. I'll be quick because most people here knowing me know I'm not so quick about that. But the whole point of me being here is I'm leading the human aspect, and we're partnering with the Friendship Bench, and we had the pleasure of going to Zimbabwe and interviewing people as well that had been through life challenges, and we are leading the work of what is considered to be the biggest mental health resource in the world, where we're capturing people's stories and putting them available around the world so that people can learn from them. And now, of course, we have also captured stories from Zimbabwe. But another reason why I'm here in this chair on this topic is when I shared my story, suicide was at the core of it, in the sense of me, myself, being several times in my life, but the crucial point I'm talking about when I was 13 years old, in the same energy. I'm quite fortunate to be alive. And I could have made my parents members of LEVE if I was not fortunate enough. And also, it seems like we share the connection and the importance of grandmothers in our personal life. So, a little lighter question before we move into things. Why do you think grandmothers or the elders, grandmothers, grandparents in general, is such a core importance for a functioning community?
That's a great question. I think they're important because they have the lived experience. When you have people who've lived for decades and they carry the battle scars of life with grace and dignity, they are such a powerful resource that communities need to leverage and utilize to solve some of the everyday problems that we face, particularly relationship problems. At least that's what I have learned, and I've figured this out not only in Zimbabwe. We now have friendship benches in a lot of different places, and the message is always the same. The role that the elders can play in our communities, we need to amplify that.
And one of the narratives that we see in your film as well, but that has also been shown around. I was told the same when I went to Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe and to many other parts of the world as well, is that in countries where you've had a context of war or a context of poverty, it somehow ends up in the middle of the story of no matter what is the issue. So also when it comes to suicide or mental health, it seems to be that's the reason. But you're sitting in Norway, one of the most privileged countries on the planet, and we have the same problem. Japan, same, US, the same, UK, the same. And I know you've had the pleasure of visiting many of these countries as well. So how do you explain that concept today with all the knowledge that you have now? What do you place in the core of why people in such different contexts can be in the same hopelessness?
I think, Jimmy, I think firstly, all human beings connect through stories, and all human beings crave for human interaction of some sort at some level. And when you look at the world today, it's become increasingly disconnected. And I think this is partly why the Friendship Bench is also attractive in a lot of communities. You know, I don't see the Friendship Bench as a mental health program anymore. I see it as an entry point towards addressing society's challenges, particularly loneliness, and I think this is why it resonates with different cultures across the globe. Yeah.
And of course, you touched upon it in the film, but what do you see as the core component of being able to move beyond the concept of suicide or hopelessness, and the narrative as well, with the beautiful conversation, very tough conversation, and very nice example of how you should be direct. There's a lot of us that don't know, and we're very scared of saying, do you have thoughts about suicide? Just as a concept, in Norway, we're 6 million people, and it's considered to be that 600,000 people have suicidal ideations or thoughts at any given time, 10% of the population. But that in itself is not dangerous. But when your counselor as well, he asked, do you have plans? Is this concrete? Do you have a date? That's where the seriousness increases. But what do you see as the key component of being able to move beyond those components?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge that we face in today's modern world is the over-medicalization of human suffering. Now, I'm not dismissing the diagnosis. The diagnoses are important, but when you emphasize diagnosis, you remove the power of community to intervene. And this is what I consistently see in a lot of communities. But when you shift the power dynamics, and when communities realize that actually I can talk to someone who is suicidal, the ball game changes completely. When we started Friendship Bench, it was one of my concerns. Being Western trained as a psychiatrist, my worry was always, what if someone is suicidal? These grandmothers cannot manage a suicidal person. And we had a lot of measures in place to address that. But with time, we realized that the majority of people presenting with suicidal ideation are crying out for help. They want space to feel vulnerable and open up. And often when we kick back and say, you need to see a specialist, you need to see a psychiatrist, we are actually denying them entry into our spaces, because society has taught us to not intervene, because this is something that requires a specialist, So I think that's part of the problem. We need to realize as communities, there's a lot we can do to just make people feel that sense of belonging in our environment and communities.
Mm-hmm. I remember as well from being in that energy myself. I was talking about when I was 13, but again, when I was 27, then I was seen as a capable young man. I had friends, I had family. They weren't with me at the time because I was in Singapore when I had an accident that kind of took away my identities again. I was left with the question of, who am I if I can't do sports and if I'm not a shipping talent anymore? But in that context, I felt that it was so hard for me to be able to utilize the network that I had, even though I had them. And I also feel that is a misconception that we see too often, is that we're saying, the people that are in these kinds of energies are the ones that are isolated and living in a cabin where no one can access them, or in a rural village. But what do you see as the most common obstacles that kind of hinders people from utilizing their friends, for example, or the people that are very close to them, that might make Friendship Bench so successful, being an outsider that they can go to?
I think the biggest consistent hindrance that we see in all places, including in Africa, is our devices. We have become so attached to our devices that we interact a lot more with our phones than with other human beings. And I think part of the solution is to find space where we can interact as human beings. At Friendship Bench, one of the things that we always say is, when you sit on the bench, no devices, because then you really connect. So I think that's the biggest barrier, that I've come across that I think is consistently cross-cutting in both developed and developing spaces.
Speaking and moving forward in that context, as you said, you've done work, which you showed us the map as well in here. So El Salvador, the US, the UK, then the surrounding areas around Zimbabwe and Vietnam. What do you see as the commonalities, especially maybe if we talk about the younger generation, where there's a lot of talk about that now? Younger generation are struggling. You mentioned devices, but of course there are other components as well than just blaming social media for everything here in life. So what do you see is the differences, but also the similarities between the countries that you have been and learned about the dynamics of mental health challenges for youth?
Again, it comes to connecting, and when you go to countries where you have, can you hear me? Yeah. So when you go to countries where you have a more collectivist culture, where you have the extended family system, like in Africa, it seems a lot of these challenges are a lot easier to deal with because you have all these different levels of connections. You have the intergenerational connectedness, which is such a powerful thing at Friendship Bench. It's something that I didn't actually think would ever work, but we see this very powerful connection, the grandmothers and young people, so I think it also has to do with the way we relate to each other within families. I know in Europe there's a tendency to have the nuclear family, and it's not very spread out. And also, you can't call any random grandmother here your grandmother, whereas in Africa it's very normal to call someone you're not related to grandma, and they'll call you grandchild. And those kind of terms, which we still use a lot in Africa, they make it easier to connect as human beings. And the whole concept of storytelling. African culture is an oral culture, where we believe a lot in the power of stories. And I think a lot of the success at Friendship Bench has to do with that element of storytelling as well.
Speaking of storytelling, as we said, we captured the stories. This is a film. So you have also moved into the space of utilizing technology in Friendship Bench. How do you see the positives of the power of how storytelling can take Friendship Bench into a new space, especially among youth? As you said, one of your strategies was being able to reach youth at a wider level.
I think, I guess when I first started Friendship Bench, I was thinking as a psychiatrist, a scientist. I had not yet truly appreciated the power of stories until, I really got deep with the first 14 grandmothers that I worked with. And so for me, stories are everything. Yes, the science is important, but without that platform for storytelling, healing cannot happen.
You're also telling me that this is connected to how you're hiring people. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, so, again, we learn from mistakes, all of us, don't we? When I first started Friendship Bench, I always emphasized on skills. I want people who are highly skilled. I want to hire people with skills. But with time, I realized that actually what's the most important thing in life are finding people who share your values. Finding people who share your values and teaching them the skills that you need to teach them. If you get someone who has skills and values, that's a bonus. And also what is important is when you have people who are working with you who can articulate their own stories, whether it's a painful story, whether it's a story of joy, those are the people you want to work with. storytellers who are aligned with your values, they change the world. They are the people who change the world, I believe.
You have, as you've said, been incredibly successful over the last 20 years, and for everyone that has been in that kind of journey, it didn't come overnight, obviously, as you tried to say yourself as well. But there are growth pains in growing quick. And no matter if you're accredited and given a lot of, positive discussions, you have a tendency as well to see certain things in the system and certain things in the world that is hindering the progress that we're talking about here. You're saying the vision would be to have a friendship bench within the reach of anyone, everywhere. But what have you seen the last 20 years in the system or in the narratives of the world that is actually in the way of succeeding with that mission?
Yeah, so there are global systems or structures. When you are an organization that becomes globally recognized, there's a lot more scrutiny, there's a lot more structure that is required of you. It becomes very rigid. You report to a board, and sometimes it makes it difficult to move fast, because you have all these restrictions, but at the same time, it's a catch-22. If you don't have those restrictions in place, no one wants to give you money. In fact, it almost seems in the world today, Jimmy, that the more rigid you are, the more likely you are to get money. It's like you can't be flexible. And I think, what is really needed is those that support organizations on the ground need to be a lot more flexible. It has to be trust-based. We still haven't reached a level where we trust organizations, particularly organizations from the global south. There's always that element of skepticism, which actually makes it difficult to implement and do the work that we're supposed to do. So I wish we had a situation where funders could truly appreciate the need for leveling the playing field. The playing field is not level. That's the biggest problem with impact in the social entrepreneurial space.
Then you work in psychiatry, psychology, which is, of course, highly extinguished academic level as well, that has this fascinating flawlessness in it that I've also experienced over the last 10 years. And, of course, as we know, here in Norway, 50% of the people we lose to suicide, they are lost in treatment. So the flawlessness doesn't match the numbers, obviously. There is no guarantee, as you shared opening this film as well yourself. One of the toughest calls you've ever gotten as a professional is that one of your clients took their own life. There's no guarantee. How do you feel that this perception of flawlessness connected to the professional is part of the problem, hindering ordinary people sitting here being open and talking to the people close to them that is opening up about suicide?
I think it's a big problem. It is a very big problem because we believe so much in the diagnostic criteria that are out there. Whether it's ADHD or it's anxiety, whatever it is, we place so much faith in these scientific terms. Now, of course, that's all we have right now. But communities need to understand that those things are not perfect. Communities also need to understand that since time immemorial, communities supported themselves. And we need to strike a balance between the science and what communities can do, because I really believe the world today is at such an inflection point where communities need to start taking ownership. We have outsourced our well-being to institutions for too long. It's time for us to take ownership, because there's so much we can do as communities. I think that's the bottom line.
You touched upon the symbiosis between here the academic, the more structured community, and the spiritual. And yesterday you shared a small story about El Salvador, that when you went there and you did the theory of change is when you're trying to understand what would be the right way of doing things in this community, which is an important component of not just repeating what you've done in Zimbabwe. What did you learn about that symbiosis that might be a key element for people here to think about when they think about how do we solve this in our own community?
Yeah, I think what's important is to think outside the box and not make assumptions. When we went to El Salvador, again, when you're getting into something for the first time, you tend to be skeptical, and the whole idea of involving, Catholic nuns to do this work seemed a bit, far-fetched, But when you immerse yourself in the environment and you get to understand the context, the history of El Salvador, and why the community has faith in these community sisters and nuns, you then understand why you need to actually work with them. It was the same thing in Zanzibar, with the imams and the mosques. We realize that we can't just exclude religion because we think it will be an obstacle. So I think it's all about being open-minded and really working with what is at community level, but most importantly driven by the community itself.
As we said as well, and we also saw it here, Leve is an organization connected to people that are left behind with a lot of questions, but also a big drive to find a new purpose in life. The Gogos, most of them mentioned their purpose. We've met many of them as well, and we've seen similar purposes. I have the same purpose connected to me. I know you do as well. How do you see the power of lived experience driving your own purpose to being a helper or being a supporter, no matter if it's a lay health worker or if it is a psychiatrist?
What I've learned from the grandmothers is that lived experience has this ability to intuitively provide you with that expressed empathy because you've lived it. You can respect and understand other people around you, and just being immersed in that becomes therapeutic on its own.
And of course, the important question. You have spent most of your life, of course, in Zimbabwe, but you also spent larger parts of your life now abroad, especially in the UK. What do you think is an important and key lesson or cultural asset that you can think we should learn from when it comes to learning from Zimbabwe to the UK, Norway, to other parts of the world?
Community. The power of community and the importance of intergenerational connectedness. We need to find ways of harnessing the wisdom of the elders in our communities and using that to connect with young people. Because our young people today are lost. They are not grounded in reality. And I think at least from what I've seen, with in Zimbabwe and other places, when you bring that intergenerational connectedness together, magic happens. Young people get a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. The elders also, treat their loneliness. So it just works perfectly well. And also to conclude, on that issue, in the next 5 years, the world is going to have over 1 billion people aged 65 and above. What are we doing with all these people? That's a resource. That is such a powerful resource. I know when you look at people who study geriatrics, they say, oh, the world is aging. But that is an asset because all of that is wisdom. We just need to leverage that wisdom and our communities will become much better. That's what I believe in.
There's also a difference in terms of pace. I told you yesterday as well, I was at a technology conference 20 years ago, and the guy was from the US, he was very hyped, and he was trying to sell technology to us.
Yeah.
And he said, in 10, 15 years, you're all going to be empowered so that you have more time with your family and friends. And then when I'm around talking, giving lectures, I'm saying this example, I'm asking people to raise their hands. We can do that here now as well. How many of you feel you have more time with friends and family now than you did 20 years ago? Exactly. So we were sold a lie, obviously. And when we were in Zimbabwe, we felt that there was a different energy in the tempo of life. But we also, and the same is in Norway, feel that the tempo in life in the small village I'm from is different than Oslo. So the rural side is different than Harare.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think we need to do in terms of the tempo and the hypedness of the speed, the way that we live, to be able to actually feel better?
Mm-hmm. I think part of the response to that is, I'm fortunate that I travel quite a lot. I think the Western world needs to learn one or two things from Africa. Yes, Africa is developing. We don't have the resources and the technology that the West has, but when you look at the way we interact with each other, I'm always surprised when I'm in Europe how that you can be in a tram full of people and you feel lonely. That doesn't happen in Africa. If you get on a bus with strangers, everyone engages with you. I wish, the Western world could adopt that kind of lifestyle. It would be very healthy for everybody. So I think that's what's missing. That's really what's missing. The ability to engage, at a very visceral level as human beings, because that is what the world needs today.
As you said, this is maybe the country in the world that needs that lesson the most. Remember during the pandemic, all of us were just thinking, so we basically do what we did yesterday, staying 2 meters apart. We know this. So we definitely need to be challenged on that element. To round things off, before we will open up for a couple of questions here as well, we will take 2 questions from the audience. I will run around. So if you just raise your hand, and of course, in all of these, we know everyone wants to say a lot of things. He's going to stick around for a few minutes after. So if you just have a comment, you can leave that for Dixon himself after. But if you have an actual question, then please raise your hand, and I will come and give you the mic so that Prof can answer it. We have one here. Do we have one more? Up there. All right.
Thank you for sharing this with us. So it seems to me that in Norway we are under some serious delusion or illusion of the importance of individualism. So, because I sense what I see, and I have worked in Africa a little bit, and I mean, just with the singing, with these things that you're sharing, you use the word community, because we think we know the word community to some extent. Of course, we see that we don't value the older people so much, but there seems to be something more that you have and that you know about, but you're not formulating it. What it is that we're missing, because I lived in the UK for 15 years and it's a very, very strange place. Norway is too, of course. But we are not relating, and what I see is relating, and doesn't this, I mean, as a psychiatrist, this is about a basic lack of connecting with ourselves and then our inability to connect with each other, because we are being told that we are individuals, meaning like islands individuals.
That is so true.
And how is that? How is your life experience? What actually is lived but not spoken about in Africa? What is actually lived?
So I can tell you what is lived in Africa and not spoken about. So, for instance, I have my mother, but I have several mothers. My mom's young sister, older sister, those are all my mothers. My father's brothers are all my fathers. And so you just have a wider base of people you can relate to. And I think there's an element of spontaneity which we have, which we have in Africa. We easily break into song. We easily break into prayer, with people you don't know, strangers, and I think those things really do connect people, and also just that vulnerability. I always find it easier to be vulnerable with these grandmothers. I talked about in the documentary there. I talked about the loss of my patient. The people that I first opened up to were the grandmothers, because of their ability to just embrace and pray for you and sing with you. All those soothing things that I think here, it seems, when I spend a lot of time in the UK, and the only time we collectively sing is on Christmas Day when we do Christmas carols, but in my country we're always singing. Yeah, so it could be those kind of finer elements.
Thank you so much for sharing a very inspiring story. And I wanted to follow up with this idea of community, which I think is really important. The friendship bench is a conversation between two people, right? And there's something that happens there in that interaction, which is about two people relating as human beings. So my question was really, how does that then move back to transformation in the community? So how do you connect this one-on-one exchange with shifts in the community, which I think is also very important in relation to the question that was asked just now? Thank you.
So I think one of the shifts is in the support groups. Those support groups are embedded in the community, where people in groups engage in very specific activities that are aimed at addressing different issues that they are struggling with. But also I think, as I was saying, the element of family, like in my neighborhood where I live in Zimbabwe, the neighbor will send me a WhatsApp message and say, hey, I have a lot of avocados. Do you want to get some avocados? Somebody will say, I've got too many tomatoes. I don't see that in the UK, that element of just, you've got something, give to your neighbors, those little things, they make a huge difference, yeah.
And another element to your question as well, when we were in Zimbabwe, we also saw, of course, in the context of mental health, when someone has gotten help in that conversation, as you said on the bench, sometimes just one session, other times we see they become friends for life, they go back to the community. One of the most powerful interventions that has ever been done was training adolescents on hygiene. The adolescents brought it home, they taught it to the family and so on, and then everyone knew it. So it's the same context here, right? So you've said that you have you've met 100,000 people, which is incredibly impressive. But each of those people have learned stigma is less than we think. Conversations is closer than we think. We don't necessarily need Prof. Dixon, even though you're a very nice man, but maybe I can talk about it with my friend instead.
Yep.
So you probably touched most of the country with those 100,000 people as well.
We're actually now sitting at over 500,000, because this documentary was made a while back, But the other thing I want to add, in Africa, in African cultures, we all have a totem, and anyone who shares your totem is your relative. So I can have someone who has my totem is monkey. So I can have someone who has a totem monkey who lives 200 kilometers away. And that's the first thing we always do when we meet. Hi, how are you? How are the goats? How are the chickens? What's your totem? Oh, you're my relative. That kind of stuff. And I think maybe that's one of the sort of nuanced things that you tend to see in Africa, this connection in many different ways linked to nature as well,
The true danger of what you spoke about is what also I was said when I was 27. I felt like I was in the maze of independence. I had my entire life been cherished for doing things alone. As you said, hyper individualism. And it's incredibly dangerous because you can literally sit in the middle of this room and that is, you haven't had a conversation for the whole month, right? And also when I wanted and needed to be vulnerable, I felt it was impossible for me to take off that mask and admit from my maze of independence that now I need you, my community. It was impossible, even though it was dependent on my life, and I was suicidal. So I was literally dependent on my life to talk to someone, and I couldn't. So there's definitely a core component here of us truly teaching as well, but challenging the narratives of what we're saying here, challenging the media, challenging the school, challenging the system, challenging the family. It's not enough to just talk about it and come to a film screening and then think we've done the job, right? So truly embracing what Prof. Dixon is saying here and bringing it back home to your family might be the most important thing you will ever do in your life, of changing our society again into a space where we can actually say in 10 years we learned something and now it's better. Now it's more similar to Zimbabwe in many ways. Thank you so much again, and a huge round of applause for Dixon. I think not, if I'm accurate, that we will have to move outside, right? But Dixon will be outside a little bit so that the ones who have comments or want to just say hello to him, he will be just outside of the hall. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Wajiban dan para, wajiban dan para, wajiban dan para, wajiban dan para, wajiban dan